Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, Excellencies, honorable speakers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's parallel discussion. My name is Muddafir Manan. Just call me Rizal. I'm currently Vice Chairperson of National Commission on Human Rights, well-known Komnas HAM, who will moderate this parallel session. This session is entitled Islam, Human Rights, Civil Society and Grassroots Movements and the Media. Based on the title, there are 5 issues to be discussed today. I think it's interesting to know how the relationship between among these issues, particularly the role of civil society and media in relation to Islam and human rights. We have about 2 hours for this parallel session, and we have 3 speakers for this session. The committee has arranged the order of the speakers, so it is not the decision of the moderator, but rather the committee, who will be the first, the second, and the third speaker. The first speaker is Professor Nadir Hussein. He has been working as a senior lecturer at Faculty of Law, Monash University. Previously, he was as associate professor at the School of Law, University of Wollongong. He holds 2 PhD from different university. The first one from the University of Wollongong, and the second one from the National University of Singapore. And he is well known for his expertise in Sharia and Indonesian law. Also pay attention to the issues of the Constitution, human rights, and anti-corruption. I think he is a prolific writer with many publications. What a great achievement. And the second speaker is Ms. Diana Syed. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Muslim Women's Center for Human Rights. She is an international human rights lawyer with experience working in both Australia and the United States of America. She holds a master in international human rights law and expert on issues about gender equality, social justice, and human rights. The last, but certainly not the least, the third speaker is Mr. Abdul Mughis Muddafir. He is currently an honorary fellow at the Asia Institute, the University of Melbourne, and lecturer at the Department of Sociology at Universitas Negeri Jakarta. His work have been published in international journal and publisher. His research interests include political economy of Indonesia, democratic politics, privatized violence, and Islamist politics. Let me first greeting the speakers and allow me to mention your first name. Professor Nadir, how are you doing? Sorry, I can't hear your voice. The committee perhaps can assist me to make sure the voice is running well.
It's okay now. The host already unmute me. It's okay.
Okay. Thank you, Prof. Nadir. A long time no see you. It's good to see you again. The last time we met, we enjoyed kabuli rice. I hope it's not difficult for you to find kabuli rice around Victoria, Melbourne. And next, Miss Diana, how do you do?
Can you hear me and see me?
Oh yeah, I can hear your voice now. Thank you, thank you.
Yes.
And
Great.
Mr. Abdul, how's it going?
Hello, Pak. Hi, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Just to make sure your voice can be heard here. All right, I will give 20 minutes for each speaker to present their points, and I will remind the speaker if the time for presentation is nearly up, and after the presentation of the speakers, we will have about 1 hour for discussion, for question from the participants, both in this room and from online. All right, without further ado, let us start by the first speaker, Professor Nadir Hussein. The time is yours.
Thank you, Pak Rizal. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Wa bihi nasta'in. Ala umuri dunya waddin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. Thank you once again, Pak Rizal. Thank you, Komnas HAM. And also thank you, Indonesia Ministry of Religious Affairs, for having me. The world has seen a continuing struggle for the freedom of expression, including the freedom of speech and freedom of the press, often going hand in hand with the endeavor to limit the power of governments. The freedom of expression can be considered an essential aspect of the individual's defense against government, just as the suppression of the freedom of expression is essential to tyranny. Human rights defenders also rely heavily on this right to challenge government's indifference to or infliction of human rights abuses. And as a freedom of expression is a foundation for religious and political activities, it is often exercised in concert with the right to freedom of thought and assembly. Sadly to say, in many Muslim countries, press freedom, freedom of opinion, freedom of association, and freedom of movement could not be maintained without having religious freedom first. So for instance, if the media published its report about the discrimination faced by religious minority groups, the government could quickly arrest the journalists or even cancel the media license. We should also have the right to agree or disagree with those in power and to express these opinions in peaceful protests. But again, in many Muslim countries, those rights didn't exist. The guarantees of freedom of conscience and religion are closely related to other substantive rights. For instance, the rights to freedom of expression, assembly, and association are fundamental to holding religious belief and practicing one's religion. Thoughts and views are intangible before they have been expressed, and convictions are valuable for a person only if he or she can express them. However, in many Muslim countries, once again, we could see that the government could easily arrest and put the minority groups or even the political oppositions into the jail simply because they criticize the government. And then also in many Muslim countries, we see that the government use the idea of riddah, or what we call it, murtad, in order to punish people who criticize the government. Then they can use the religious card in order to control the oppositions. So in that context, my colleague and I from Ilios Justice in Monash University several months ago released a report that examines the extent to which states commit or are complicit in killings that violate religious freedom. So it explores the relationship between the retentions of the death penalty for religious offenses and other forms of state-sanctioned killings motivated by alleged religious offending or by religious identity. As of 2020, blasphemy was formally criminalized in some 84 countries. As many as 21 countries criminalized apostasy as of 2019. So keeping in mind that acts such as apostasy and blasphemy may be variously encompassed under alternate criminal laws, the number of states in which offenses against religion are informally criminalized is likely much higher. The legal penalties for such offenses range from fines to imprisonment to corporal punishment, and in at least 12 countries, the death penalty. So the report that we released several months ago focused on the 12 states in which offenses against religion are lawfully punishable by death. We look at Afghanistan, Brunei, Iran, Maldives, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. We examine 4 different types of state-sanctioned killings for religious offenses: apostasy, blasphemy, or alike, or affiliations, most commonly membership of a religious minority, judicial executions, extrajudicial killings, killings by civilians, and killings by extremist groups. So some of the results that I can report to you, that Islam is the state religion in 11 of the 12 countries that being reviewed. Nigeria is the exception. And in all 12 countries, the death penalty for offenses against religion stems from and is justified on the basis of Islamic law. Death sentences were imposed for offenses against religion in at least 6 countries: Iran, Mauritania, Nigeria, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. And executions were actually carried out in at least 1 country, which is Iran. The death penalty appears to have been used to persecute religious minorities in 2 countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia. In both countries, in both cases, religious minorities were grossly overrepresented in execution statistics and killed in circumstances suggesting that the charges of which they were formally convicted, political, security, or drug-related offenses, were often simply a pretext. Then, looking beyond the death penalty, and the following forms of state-sanctioned killing have been documented since 2010. We also noticed the extrajudicial killings in 4 countries, including killing of religious offenders in Pakistan and of religious minorities by supportive forces in Nigeria and Yemen. Death in custody of religious offenders in Pakistan and of religious minorities in Iran. Enforced disappearances of religious minorities in Yemen, and assassination of persons deemed sympathetic to religious offenders, such as lawyers and politicians in Pakistan. So it's also dangerous then if you as a lawyer or a politician, you support the religious offenders. And also hate crimes motivated by victims' religious affiliation in Iran and Pakistan. So then the idea that a state or mainstream religions need forceful protection, in some cases to the extent of lethal violence, is created or at the very least legitimized in those 12 countries, 12 Muslim countries, by the presence of the death penalty for religious offenses. And the impact of abolishing the death penalty for religious offenses is likely to extend far beyond the stemming of executions. On this basis, potential exists for such reform to similarly stem the judicial and extrajudicial killing of religious minorities and killings of perceived religious offenders or religious minorities carried out by civilians. Already mentions about that religious freedom is the core values for those other substantive rights like religious, freedom of press, freedom of association, and freedom of movement. Then, when we look at the term of riddah, or turning back from Islam, which is probably the closest to what is known in the West as religious offenses, including apostasy and blasphemy, and then we can see that riddah is punishable by death in those 12 countries that I already mentioned. And in all 12 countries, Sharia is cited as the reason for the punishments. But the Holy Quran is clear, La ikraha fid din, there shall be no coercion in matters of faith. Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 256. And the Quran is silent on any punishment for riddah. And I'm going to share 3 reasons why the Sharia does not mandate the death penalty for riddah. So first, one who changes his religion shall be killed is a famous hadith often used to justify the death penalty, but it has only been conveyed by one narrator, or we call it ahad, hadith ahad. Many scholars agree that hadith ahad is not enough to call for the death penalty. Second, even if we accept that this hadith ahad prescribes the death penalty for riddah, contemporary Islamic scholars argue that the death penalty was never intended to be applied for a change of faith, if we look at the history of Islam, but to punish treason. And third, many classic scholars argue that the punishment for riddah is mandatory death penalty known as hudud. However, contemporary scholars argue that the Hanafi school dispute this position. The contemporary scholars argue that the legal authorities should have the discretion, known as ta'zir, to decide the appropriate punishment from forgiveness, that is no punishment, to the death penalty. So we have seen a new position emerging among contemporary Islamic scholars. There is a growing consensus that the Quran prescribes no temporal punishment for offenses against religion. Indeed, Islam is the state religion in both Tunisia and Morocco, but neither prescribes the death penalty for riddah. In countries where codified legislation prescribes the death penalty for riddah, it is often vague, ambiguous, and broad, and has been directed against political opponents, minority groups, progressive scholars, and activists whose lives are under threat because of these laws. The Quran embraces religious freedom, guaranteeing religious freedom while retaining the death penalty for such behavior, in my view, is not true religious freedom. So I think Islamic scholars need to come together in promoting, protecting, and maintaining religious freedom, because as I said earlier, in many Muslim countries, you could not have press freedom, freedom of opinion, and freedom of association, and freedom of movement, unless you try really hard to maintain that you have religious freedom. So thank you very much. I'll leave it here. Thank you, Pak Rizal. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Professor Nadir. Interesting points you raised from your presentation. You highlighted extrajudicial killing, death penalty, the religious freedom, and so forth. Once again, thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite the second speaker, Ms. Diana Syed, to convey his thought on this topic. Without further ado, the time is yours, Ms. Diana.
Thank you so much, and just want to make sure that you can hear me all right. You can hear me fine? Yes, okay, great. Assalamu alaikum everyone as well. Lovely to be part of this conference. My name is Diana Syed. I am an international human rights lawyer, but also the CEO, as mentioned, of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. And we have been an organisation for over 30 years, working in Australia in a uniquely Australian context for Muslim women, and was an organisation that was started for Muslim women to actually work on issues pertaining to family violence, settlement for new refugees and migrants who arrive in Australia with their families, and to provide a lot of support for them as minorities in a uniquely Australian context. So over the 30 years, we have been running programs for women, parenting, leadership, settlement, but also providing a lot of casework support for women who might be experiencing issues of family violence in an Australian context. And that could be early and forced marriage or wanting to seek Islamic divorce. So we, work with human rights defenders in terms of we always are advocating for more rights and resources for Muslim women and their families who might be experiencing Islamophobia here, particularly in a post 9/11 world where there was a lot of prejudice and hate crimes towards Muslim communities, but particularly Muslim women who wore the hijab here in Australia. There was a rise in hate speech, vilification, attacks on Muslim women and their families on public transport, in schools, access to employment, and then racism played a big part in that as well. So we always are advocating for policies in Australia to safeguard Muslim women, minority communities, families, ensuring rights of access to employment, education, support services, and access to resources here. So, when we talk about the Muslim, as the previous speaker talked about, countries and enshrining rights within majority Muslim countries for human rights defenders, such as lawyers or other freedom of speech advocates. I come from an experience where we are a Muslim minority within a majority country that is non-Muslim. So the context is quite different for us, but we are always having to ensure that we are asserting our rights and freedoms to practice our religion, our faith in an environment where it is safe to do so. And we always have to work extra hard to ensure that women and children and families are safe within a context that we are experiencing in a post 9/11 world where there is a lot of targeted hate speech towards Muslims. And particularly with social media, we've seen that with the rise of Facebook and Twitter. I know that Indonesia is a very big tweeting country, that there is a lot of hate speech on there that goes unchecked and unverified, and there's a lot of fake news and hate speech that is allowed to exist on these platforms, and it creates an enabling environment for people to access false information which feeds prejudice and hate. So that is a responsibility on governments as well around the world to implement safeguards and online sort of mediums to enable people to have discussion and debate and freedom of thought, but it should be balanced with responsibilities not to share information that is not correct, and it can fuel hate towards certain minority communities. So there's a lot of underlying issues still in an Australian context that we are always trying to do advocacy and ensure that there are policies to protect our communities, but particularly for women. where we know that women don't have the same equal rights and access. So we are always trying to create capabilities and capacity in women to speak up, to exercise their rights. Sometimes a lot of newly arrived Muslim communities to Australia don't have language abilities, and in turn don't have an understanding of the laws in Australia. They don't understand that, they can access their rights, particularly for women, where we know that gender is a very patriarchal normative value in a lot of Muslim cultures, a lot of Muslim countries. And so when women come to Australia, there is a period of adjustment that they have where there's that cultural context and understanding about the role of women and what role women should play, and maintaining their faith and their identity is very important to them. And so we don't want to compromise that, but we want to provide support and information for women and their families and the men as well to adjust to an Australian context. And there are a lot of challenges with that as well, particularly if they've come from a Muslim majority country. They've never experienced what it's like to be a minority or even be able to articulate their experiences of Islamophobia and racism, because they've never had to experience that in their home countries. So there's a lot of work that we do in that space as well to provide that information and that awareness, and build capabilities and capacity. And we do that in a way that, women who want to access Islamic divorce. So in an Australian context, obviously, if women go to the civil courts, they can access a divorce there, but then some of them will also want to get the Islamic talaq. And so there is an authority that has been set up here in Australia. It's called the Board of Imams. And we have to go before the Board of Imams and request the right of a Muslim woman to get granted her Islamic divorce. And sometimes we have to do a lot of advocacy for a woman to access her right to her mab, to her rights to the children, and those sorts of issues can be a little bit complicated and difficult to navigate within an Australian judicial system that doesn't recognise Sharia law. It's a common law system from the British. And so how do we navigate the duality of the two systems within the Australian context, which sometimes is difficult to enforce, to implement it, and to ensure the rights of a woman are maintained in that context. The same issue goes for early and forced marriage. Culturally, marriage is very important to families, particularly those newly arrived communities who want to maintain their culture and sometimes the safety and security of young women. And so they will arrange for a early and marriage for young women. But in an Australian context, women or men who are under the age of 18 are not permitted to be married. So even if your family or your parents take you to an imam and have you married under 18, it's actually unlawful and illegal under the Australian law. And so this was a new law that came in 2015. And a lot of Muslim communities and families did not understand that now they actually were not allowed to have their young daughters or their young sons married under 18. And so we had to do a lot of work to educate families, the local religious leaders, imams, the young women in schools about this new law, because otherwise they would be facing prosecution by the police. They would have to be facing jail time, and that would include the parents of the children married, the imams that married them, and anyone who attended the wedding might be prosecuted by the police. So there are constant tensions and complexities around navigating cultural norms and ideas around family and values and what is acceptable in Muslim cultures and societies. And sometimes it's not always about culture, it can be specific to different countries, and the current context of what the laws are in Australia. So, and this also goes for FGM, or female genital cutting or mutilation, however you use that term. Sorry if it's very graphic or a trigger warning for those listening. So it's always sort of those issues that we're constantly navigating at the centre, and providing support and information and programs for women, and providing support to the families and the communities in an Australian context. So that's sort of a summary of what we do. We do a lot of advocacy to the Australian government. We run a lot of programs to support parents, to support newly arrived refugee communities. We do leadership programs for young women, but we really are a specialised organisation of Muslim women working to support Muslim women in an Australian context, and that is mainly through education and awareness. But also because we are from those communities, there's not that same level of judgment, but a lot of care, and, you know, we use a trauma-informed approach, a strengths-based narrative. We don't see our clients as victims, and we help build capabilities for them to self-determine and drive their own lives as well. So I think that's sort of in a nutshell. I mean, the situation with the pandemic and the rights of citizens in Australia have been severely sort of curtailed. And, you know, with our borders being restricted internally, there's been a lot of issues around press freedom, human rights defenders accessing, you know, rights to funds and charities. There's been a lot of suppression of our media as well in Australia with the monopoly. The market's just not as competitive. And I know people look at Australia and think that comparatively a Western democracy, liberal government, but there's actually been a lot of freedoms and rights that during the pandemic have been compromised and taken for granted and stripped back in the name of the pandemic, and policing people's freedom of movement, freedom of expression online. We saw defamation cases by ministers, high-level ministers, taken against normal citizens for criticising them. We're seeing a lot of the shrinking space for civil society with very restrictive charity and fundraising laws being enacted. So, you know, it's interesting to hear about trends in other Muslim majority countries, but I hate to say it, but Australia is also really lacking in a lot of our human rights at the moment as well, which we can be doing a lot better. But unfortunately, the pandemic has given people an excuse to police people, but also to wind back some very fundamental freedoms and rights as well. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Diana. It's interesting you raised some issues regarding how the condition of Muslim women in Australia at the moment. You mentioned about early marriage happened there, and also I think it's also important you highlighted the importance of to have a balance between freedom and responsibility. I think it's important thing. And also about you admitted that there is complicity and difficulty in Australia on this issue. Thank you once again, Ms. Diana. I'm going to move to the third speaker, Mr. Abdul. Please to convey your points. The time is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pak Rizal. I'm going to share a PowerPoint if I can. Can I do that? Yeah. Okay. I hope you can already see the screen that I share. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present my thoughts about Islamism, religious moderation, and the threats to civil and political rights. So this is actually an idea how to explain the correlations between maybe Islamic movement and Islam and human rights, but specifically also analyze about how Islamic political movement and how a response undertaken by especially Indonesian government to the perceived rising Islamism pose serious threats to civil and political rights. So instead of, we have maybe been talking about how the idea of Islamism or Islamic radicalism threats protections to civil and political rights in general. But in this case, I would like to highlight the way the government respond to Islamism is another problem that actually pose serious threats to civil and political rights itself. So this presentation actually based on the problems about rising Islamic conservatism that is especially happened especially after the 2017 Jakarta gubernatorial elections that imprisoned incumbent governor Basuki Cahayapurnama or Ahok due to his likely blasphemy case. And this Islamic conservatism that is more pronounced, it is more pronounced in public life and also in political arena. In the public life, we can see that many people more and more expressing their piety publicly in public arena in Indonesia. And in political arena, we can see that many Islamic conservative narratives has been mobilized by contending political actors in the especially in the electoral contest. Like we can see actually started from 2014 that we can see very clearly, and then more pronounced in 2019. And the characteristic of Islamic conservatism, we can see that they embrace a view that are anti-pluralism, anti-liberalism, anti-secularism, and anti-communism. Like more specifically, they also some studies also identify Islamic conservatism or radicalism as an idea that embrace that has been embraced to formalize Islam or Islamize the state. This can be done either through democratic or electoral routes by participating in the elections through Islamic political parties. Just like in Indonesia, we can see there is a PKS, Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, and also through can also be undertaken through violence in an attempt to formalize Islam or Islamize the state in Indonesian context. In regard to those problems, we can see that there are some existing analysis that see the problem of rising Islamic conservatism or Islamic radicalism as a result of a broader influence of transnational ideas of Islamic fundamentalism, often been associated with Wahhabism, or the idea that is rooted in the Middle East. And this influence, especially, getting more influence, especially after 9/11. There is also explanation that analyze the rising Islamic radicalism as a result of the literal interpretations of religious text, as already explained by Prof. Nadir previously. And also, more recently, some scholars have identified problems related to the weakening of religious authority, especially from moderate Islamic extreme, often associated with groups like NU and Muhammadiyah. And the existing strategies to those problems based on this analysis is by promoting religious moderations, or undertaking de-radicalizations program, those program promoted by institutions like BNPT. There is also a strategy of promoting religious tolerance and pluralism, promoting dialogue reconciliations to the conflicting parties between different religions or beliefs. And those strategies have been undertaken actually long before the Ahok blasphemy case in 2017. But the question is but the fact is that the expressions of religious conservatism or radicalism continues on the rise, especially after the Ahok blasphemy case. And the question is why? Is despite there are many strategies have been undertaken by many parties like NGOs and then also government, especially today in the current administrations, where this program, I think, become one of the priority to respond to rising Islamism. But it continued to rise. I mean, like people, especially Indonesian Muslim, part of them, instead of they become more having a moderate understanding of Islam, they getting more like being more radicalized, responding to what, especially the government do to them. So why is it happen? Why does it happen? And then my argument is I propose an argument that it is actually a result of the limit of analysis on the emergence of Islamic conservatism and radicalism, which is dominated by cultural approach and security-oriented analysis. And those approaches, analysis, and strategies, existing strategies that have been undertaken also mostly focus on cultural matters in understanding the emergence of Islamic conservatism and radicalism. And by doing this, they tend to isolate political economic aspect. Hence, instead of seeing it simply as a cultural matters or problems of rising religious intolerance or due to the influence of the transnational ideas of Islamic fundamentalism, it is more a response. Islamism is a response to increasing socio-economic precarity and socio-political disillusionment. So, and it is also made possible by the context in which the like alternative progressive movement, and especially from the left, are absent in Indonesian context, in particularly after 1965 communist massacres. So due to those factors, Indonesian Muslims are increasingly being conservative, but they actually have no viable political vehicles. We can see that there is an Islamic political party like PKS, as I mentioned earlier, but not all those conservative Muslims channel their aspiration to this party. And this party, since maybe 2004, has stagnated electoral achievement at around 7 to 8% of votes until 2019. In the last elections, they also got the votes around 8%. And that's the limits of how they can mobilize conservative Muslim. While actually there is a rising conservatism, but they have no political channel. And besides PKS, there are also another Islamic-based parties that compete with PKS in mobilizing votes from conservative Muslim. Those are P3, PAN, and PKB. So this shows that although like Indonesian Muslim are increasingly being conservative and being Islamized, they actually have no channel they have no vehicle, political vehicle, formal political vehicle, especially political parties, to channel their interests, their aspirations, in an attempt to Islamize state or formalize Islamic value within the state institutions. And the increasingly Islamized society then, due to this context, channel their aspirations to opportunist, secular, but powerful political economic elites. The political economic elites are especially from PDIP, Golkar, and Democrat Party. Those are almost, those are secular parties, nationalist parties, politicians from this party that's especially mobilized votes from the increasingly Islamized society. So any political economic actors within that context can claim representing Islamic interests. Just we can see, like in the case of the 2019 presidential election, where Prabowo and Sandi actually have no any Islamic credential, but they were claimed by their supporter as representing the leader of Ummah. So it is actually an example of how Islamic alliance has been established, that comprises of fragmented Ummah, like the conservative Muslim, which is fragmented, as they are actually not being organized within a coherent political vehicle, and also with the secular but powerful politicians. So these are two main elements of what we see as Islamic alliance, that is often seen by the government of Indonesia as a threat to democracy, Indonesian democracy, or to religious pluralism. So based on that analysis, the problem is actually more political than cultural. We can see that one of the strategy that we mentioned, that I mentioned earlier, to address rising Islamism or Islamic radicalism is religious moderation. This is also one of the narrative being employed by the government to address the perceived rising Islamist threat. But the fact is, as this idea of religious moderations emphasizes on the cultural aspect in understanding the emergence of Islamism, instead of on the political factors, it instead raising problems like heightening identity politics and polarizing society along religious lines. Like we can see in the society, in the public, we can see that there is a conflict, religious conflict between those who embrace moderate Islamic narrative and other one who embrace more conservative views of Islam. And religious moderations also contributes in masking contests of power and material resources among elites, because it's covered with the conflict between moderate Islam and radical Islam. The real conflict is actually among elites, like we can see conflict between Jokowi and Prabowo in the 2019 presidential election, but they use political identity to mask their conflict. And the result is that society being polarized along religious line. And we can also see that this narrative is also often being used as a means to gain material benefits to the advocates of religious pluralism and Islamic moderate narrative, especially NU. There is an interesting study conducted by Mitzner and Muhtadi recently, explaining about the myths of NU's religious pluralism. So my study is actually reinforcing their findings in how actually religious pluralism, including like religious moderation's narrative to address Islamism, is actually just a myth. Like as we can see in NU, that is often portrayed as a main advocates of religious pluralism, it is just a myth, because there is a disconnection between NU's leadership and members in understanding and expressing Islamic views. Many members are expressing Islamic conservatism. Promotion of religious pluralism is often as a means to gain material benefits and access to state power. Using religious pluralism narrative also to repress more as a way to repress and use competitors in like distributing their own version of Islam. For the government, this religious pluralism narrative is often used to silence oppositions and weaken democratic institutions, like in the case of the weakening of the KPK, Corruption Eradication Commissions. This has further threatened civil and political rights. So instead of Islamism threatening civil and political rights, it is the way the government responds to Islamism that pose more serious threat to civil and political rights, that further deepens liberalism within Indonesian democratic politics. As a conclusion, the increasing Islamic conservatism should be seen more as a political economic problems instead of merely as a cultural issues, where as a cultural issue it gives way or open the ways for political economic elites to politicize this like definitions of Islamic radicalism as a cultural matter to mobilize identity politics. While the fact is, it is as we can see in many other countries, in many other studies also have shown this, that increasing Islamic radicalism or Islamist political movement is also made possible by the absence of alternative progressive movement that can channel the broadening of social economic precarity and social political disillusionment. So while within that context, the fact is that in Indonesian context, there is no viable political channel of Islamic design and aspiration. So they are actually not a group that organized and coherent as a political organizations, like the representations of Islamic political movement. As we can see, as I said previously, what the government often described as rising Islamic radicalism is actually an Islamic alliance that comprises of fragmented ummah and secular but powerful political economic elites that mobilize them. Fragmented ummah, they are fragmented because they have no political channel, political vehicle, and because of that, they always try to find any channel that can, or any political actors that they believe can channel their interest, just like when they believe in Prabowo or Sandi, who have no Islamic credential, but they believe they can channel their interests. So there is that aspect. Another aspect is that political economic elites wants to control or want to get the power of the state to control the state institutions through the elections, but they actually have no social basis. So that's why they have economic resources and political resources that they can use to mobilize those fragmented ummah. And they mobilize the fragmented ummah by pretending that they are a pious Muslim, just like what we can see in the case of the 2019 presidential election. But long before that, actually in the 1990s, Suharto already did that, like when he established ICIHR and then and many other Islamic institutions like Bank Muamalah as well, the first Islamic Syariah bank in Indonesia, to attract conservative Muslim. And so in this case, fragmented Islamic alliance is limited in the attempt to Islamize the state, instead of what the government often describe as that they are threatening to Islamize the state. But anxiety about Islamism is actually socially and politically constructed that create a misguided belief on Islamist threat, as if there is an Islamist threat in Indonesia, but actually that is just constructed by the government. What is more dangerous is actually repressive and authoritarian approach undertaken by the government to respond to the perceived Islamist threat. So is religious moderation an answer to rising Islamism? We have to think about that question. For sure, it opens the way to be used as a means to gain material resources and access to state power. The way the government responds to Islamism poses a serious threat to civil and political rights that further deepens political illiberalism. I think that's all my presentation. Over to you, Pak Rizal. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdul. You raised some important points regarding your topic. You talk about religious moderation and also about Islamic conservatism in Indonesia and you also propose a few arguments on the reasons behind it, which is related to political, economic, and social, cultural, also point of views. I think it's also important to note from your presentation that you mentioned there is no political vehicle, political channel for Islamic conservatism supporters in Indonesia. I think it's important note to be discussed. All right, I just been informed by the committee that the previous speakers have left the Zoom, and the two speakers would not continue to participate in our parallel session. As a result of that, Mr. Abdul, unfortunately, all questions directed by the all participants will be back to you. But you have a right to reject the question from the participants as long as it's not dealing with your points in your presentation. All right, I will give a time for the participants to convey their question, both in this room, offline, and online from Zoom. Please, if any question to be raised for the only speaker at the moment, Mr. Abdul. Maybe in this room? Okay, we have a participant who will ask a question to the speaker. Go ahead, Mr.
Saya bicara bahasa Indonesia.
It's okay. We have a translator.
Okay.
Will be translated by the translator directly. Yeah.
Saya Hairoman dari Kota Bekasi, DBRD Bekasi. Menarik dengan apa yang disampaikan oleh Bapak Abdul Mughis atau Abdul terkait dengan menguatnya konservatisme Islam yang mungkin ingin saya tanyakan. Kalau secara politik dia diwakilkan atau dipresentasikan dengan kehadiran PKS, yang menarik adalah adanya perubahan tidak hanya di PKS namun juga partai-partai berbasis Islam seperti P3, PAN, dan PKB yang justru semakin ke tengah. Ini kelihatannya bagaimana kita membaca ini, di sisi lain di masyarakat ada semacam penguatan konservatif Islam, namun secara politik justru partai Islam itu sendiri justru malah tertarik ke arah tengah. Bagaimana membaca ini? Apakah ini dianggap sebagai sebuah proses atau fenomena yang positif dikaitkan dengan demokratisasi kita? Jadi semakin demokratisnya partai Islam itu sendiri, atau respon apa yang bisa kita tangkap dari fenomena ini dikaitkan dengan menguatnya konservatisme Islam, namun justru respon politik dari partai-partai Islam sendiri lebih cenderung untuk lebih ke tengah. Sementara munculnya partai yang mungkin lebih cenderung mempresentasikan konservatisme Islam justru muncul di partai umat yang sekarang tampil, tapi sebagian besar partai Islam justru malah ke arah tengah. Kira-kira bagaimana kita menanggapi ataupun membaca ini sebagai sebuah fenomena demokrasi kita? Terima kasih.
Thank you, Pak Khairuman. I think the translator has translated the question, but I will to paraphrase. It's about a gap between grassroots level point of view, the so-called political conservatism, and political level elite. So, Mr. Abil, how do you read such a gap in Indonesian politics at the moment?
Thank you, Pak, for the question. I think that's still consistent with the trends where Islamic-based parties actually tend to go to the center because they don't want to be associated with the Islamic radicalism, right? While many secular nationalist parties, especially like those politicians from those parties in the local elections, right, as they do not have any connection with the central committee of the parties, they can develop to mobilize the narrative of Islamism. They all tend to be go to the right, like the secular tend to go to the right, while the Islamists tend to go to the center. This is actually part of the way they target the votes, target the society as the vote in the electoral competitions. Nowadays, we can see the tendency of many Islamic-based parties like P3, PAN, and PKB. It is clear because of as a part of the way they negotiate with the ruling elites, especially how to. This is a consequence of joining the coalition with the ruling elites, with the PDIP, that embrace more moderate or anti conservatism, Islamic conservatism. So they have to like part of their negotiation or part of the political compromise. Yeah, they have to moderate their views. They have to promote views of Islamic moderate Islamic views instead of the opposite. So it is clear that it's a result of the contemporary or recent political development where the ruling elite, and they are part of the ruling elites, embracing religious pluralism. So it's actually to gain access to the state power and also to broaden their social basis, not only exclusively to Islamic conservative groups, but also to general public, right? Because those Islamic-based parties also have the same experience with the PKS, where they votes is also stagnant at around 5 of those parties, but PKS maybe around 7 to 8% of the votes. So it is part of that kind of political negotiations and how they built, how they undertake a certain political strategy to join the alliance with the or coalition with the ruling elites, and also to broaden their bases. We can also see, like PKS previously in the 2009, the leadership of PKS tries to make the party as an open party at a time, right? It is also because of the stagnated votes that they gain only about 7% in 2009, and then they declare as an open party. But after Ahok blasphemy case, after the 2017 Jakarta gubernatorial election, they try maybe before that, with the new leadership, they try to make more could represents Islamic conservatism, but the achievement is does not change much, only about the number that I mentioned earlier. So that's the limit, actually. Also a reflection of the limits of attempt to mobilize support from Islamic conservatism. So Indonesian Muslims who are becoming more Islamized or conservative, actually very fragmented, because there is no single and coherent political vehicle. There is political ummah at the moment. We can see, and we can also predict how many percent that they can achieve in the electoral competition in the 2024 later. But certainly for certain, for sure that this new party have to compete with PKS and also with P3, PAN, and PKB to gain like not only Islamic conservative, but also general public, to make them at least can go to parliament to secure their vote. I think that's my answer. Hopefully it's answering your question.
Thank you, Mr. Abil. Maybe we have another question from the participant. I give a time to raise a question. Maybe from Zoom, but I cannot access on the chat if any participant has raised question. Maybe the committee can assist me to check it. Okay. While we are waiting for other questions, allow me as moderator, Mr. Abil, to raise a question also to you. Yeah? I think it's interesting, your points about Indonesian Islamic politics. I was wondering, to what extent does Islamic conservatism has become as a threat to the future of Indonesian democracy, given that if we look at a few reputable international surveys, yeah, which state that the situation of democracy in Indonesia is being declined. For example, Freedom House survey, yeah, Economic Intelligence Unit survey also mentioned that Indonesian democracy has declined. So, how do you read this situation relating to your points about Islamic conservatism, Islamic fundamentalism as a threat to civil and political rights?
Okay, thank you, Pak Rizal. I think, is there any non-Indonesian here? If there is no non-Indonesian, we can actually speak in Bahasa Indonesia to make us easier to understand. But because you asked in English, okay, I can respond to your question. As I mentioned in my presentations, not only the rising Islamism that become a threat to civil and political rights or to democracy, or that contributes to the declining of Indonesian democracy, but the way the government perceive this Islamic movement, and also how they pose a threat to the government, actually to the government instead of to democracy, to the ruling elites. That is the factors that contribute, that actually contributes to the declining of Indonesian democracy. I use the term instead of as democratic decline, I use the term in my presentations as the deepening of illiberalism, because Indonesian democracy has never been liberalized or consolidated. Indonesian democracy has never been consolidated or liberalized. Can be seen from many studies have identified that Indonesia actually, the rule of law in Indonesia, that's one of the element to identify whether Indonesia actually is a liberal democratic country or not. There is no, I mean, like, rule of law is relatively absent, right? Corruption is endemic. Violence is like violent groups is so pervasive, being so active also in the political arena, being mobilized by political economic elites to defend their interests, to facilitate their interests, like Preman group. Those are, how could the violent groups, Islamic militia, exist within the context of democracy? If we define them as a illiberal democracy, this actually doesn't make sense. So what we can see from those factors, Indonesian democracy has actually never been really liberalized and consolidated. While the term democratic decline is actually presuming that Indonesian democracy previously has been liberalized and consolidated. But for me, I argue that Indonesian democracy has never been liberalized and consolidated. And what happened for the last few years is actually the deepening of illiberalism instead of the declining of democracy itself. The deepening illiberalism that makes Indonesian democracy has never achieved even the civil political liberalism, what is often imagined by many scholars or international development agencies in supporting democratizations in many developing countries, including Indonesia. So while many studies have maybe, especially those that concern with the Islamic threat, with the by employing cultural analysis, they focus more on the rising Islamism as a threat to democracy that contribute making Indonesian democracy in decline or deepening illiberalism. But for me, not only them, but more importantly, more contribution made by the government of Indonesia itself in understanding and perceiving the threat made by Islamic movement and how the government respond to it. We can see that the weakening of the KPK, the destruction of the KPK, one of the important democratic institutions, have been made by mobilizing Islamic radicalism narrative. Right? The dismissal of many key or many around 50s KPK's what they call members or including the most important investigator like Novel Baswedan. They were dismissed by also using a narrative of Islamic radicalism, also using a narrative of the narrative that against this Islamic radicalism. It is a dangerous narrative being mobilized by the government by constructing that there is a serious threat from Islamism, which is actually they are not really a serious threat. As I mentioned earlier, they are very fragmented. They have no political coherent political vehicle that make them can win the state power and can Islamize the state or formalize Islamic values within a formal institution. It is different from the case like in Turkey. They have that coherent political vehicle, AKP, right? And they can, by using that vehicle, political party, they can mobilize like broader support from society and win the state power, and they control and can access like the state power to determine the direction of the state itself, and also including the constitutions. That's what happened in Turkey, right? Because they have that viable political vehicle. But in Indonesia, there are no coherent political vehicle. We can see this is the most important aspect that make them become fragmented. And they are not, as they are fragmented, so they are not a threat. While we often see that they are often constructed as a threat, but this constructed narrative is actually a means. The government means, the ruling elites means, the ruling elites instrument to consolidate their power and to further accumulate material resources or like power, like including, we can see in the case of the, as I mentioned, about the weakening of the KPK. It's actually to give away for doing corruption, but illegally, but legally, right? More protected in doing the corruption or rent seeking. I think that's my response.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Abdul. Maybe we still have other question. Okay, we have one participant in this room to raise a question. Please give a mic. Okay, go ahead.
Iya, baik, terima kasih. Mohon izin saya dengan bahasa Indonesia. Moderator dan juga narasumber. Dalam catatan sejarah politik dan juga Islam ini sangat menarik.
Excuse me, your name?
Oh,
sure.
iya, saya Heri Fatur Rahman dari Pusat Kerukunan Umat Beragama. Dalam catatan sejarah dan juga politik dan Islam ini sangat menarik. Dan bergeser terakhir 98 ketika akan muncul kembali partai katakan dari dengan menjunjung jumlah agama, ada seorang tokoh yang mengatakan pada saat itu ketika ditanya oleh wartawan, apakah Bapak akan mengusung partai yang khusus berbau agama, kurang lebih gitu. Jawabannya singkat, beliau bilang sangat kecil tubuh saya untuk memakai partai yang hanya berbau satu agama. Makanya kemudian muncullah partainya dengan bernuansa nasional. Dan sampai sekarang ada partainya, saya tahu itu. Dan rupanya berkembang. Tapi memang faktanya ketika bicara tentang partai dan politik Islam itu sejatinya tidak ansih gara-gara mayoritas muslim lalu akhirnya banyak konstituen untuk memilih itu. Itu fakta yang terjadi di antara kita. Makanya ada sebuah analogi yang sangat dahsyat, katakan pikiran yang sangat fundamentalis. Kalau memang benar-benar ingin memakai bajunya dengan Islam, badannya juga harus, kurang lebih tanda kutip begitu. Jangan cuma bajunya saja. Artinya begini, nilai-nilai yang ada di dalamnya harus ikut. Katakan contoh yang paling sporadis ketika Anda mengangkat tentang tadi tersebut kita bilang tentang KPK dan segala macam. Ada mengusung ketika Anda dalam pemilihan ketika dibawa untuk pemilihan sebagai caleg dan segala macam atau partai Anda ingin mengusung benar-benar sangat tanda kutip basa-basi ketika dikatakan saya anti korupsi. Ya sudah selesai. Masyarakat Indonesia sudah selesai dengan kata-kata itu, ya. apalah dengan kata-kata yang jargon yang perbuatan yang tidak baik. Tapi kalau dibantu dengan misal, memang sangat sporadis. Ketika saya akan melakukan atau saya ditindak melakukan korupsi misalnya, maka peti mati ini sebagai saksi nanti saya akan masuk, misalnya begitu. Ini mungkin masyarakat akan lebih tercengang, ini nggak main-main nih, gitu. Artinya apa? Bukan hanya nilai bajunya, katakan misalkan Islam, misalkan, ya, tapi juga dalamnya harus ikut. Saya pikir ini akan menjadi sebuah pertimbangan yang lain, mungkin dalam pandangan masyarakat. Tapi hanya kalau jargon hanya nama itu masyarakat nampaknya sudah sangat luar biasa. Bahkan di Indonesia nggak tanggung-tanggung, kiblatnya ada di sini partai. Bayangkan kiblatnya ada di sini nama partai. Tapi apakah itu menjamin? Tapi kan juga tidak juga. Artinya berbondong-bondong ke sana. Ini sebagai sebuah ilustrasi saja dan juga pencerahan buat kita bersama. Tapi intinya adalah Indonesia cenderung pada umumnya adalah Bhinneka Tunggal Ika. Nampaknya kita sudah selesai lah ke dalam kehidupan beragama, toleransi segala macam. Tapi dengan konteks antara partai yang berbau agama, katakan misalkan Islam, ruhnya juga nilai-nilai harus ikut. Itu yang mungkin bisa dikatakan bisa mengusung nilai yang besar. Tapi juga ekses manfaatnya buat umat-umat yang lain. Gitu, tidak hanya sendiri. Itu saja, terima kasih atas kesempatannya.
Thank you Pak Heri. The main question is about Islamic Party. Yeah. There is a doubt that the so-called Islamic Party in Indonesia is a really Islamic party, given that it's only a label using Islamic for the party, but the content of the so-called Islamic Party itself not really Islamic. I think the point, the main point from Pak Heri is like that. Please, Mr. Abdul, to answer the question.
All right. I'm a single resource person now. Okay. I think your observations is 100% valid for me. Like, it explains why Islamic parties or political parties that use or mobilize Islamic rhetorics or ideals or ideology is not so successful in the democratic era in Indonesian context. As I mentioned, they never gains the highest electoral achievement since 1999 or since 2004 maybe in the direct elections, right? So they stagnate to around 5% or 7%. But if we collect them into those several Islamic parties and Islamic-based parties into one party, one single parties, just like Masyumi in the old time in the Sukarno era, they might gain a bigger votes than what we can see today. It means that many political parties actually quite also fragmented. Also, they might have similar values or like ideology or ideals that they are supporting, but actually there is no fixed ideology. Many studies have revealed that most parties actually are identical. It is difficult to differentiate between one party to another. Like so there is no ideology actually in Indonesian political parties. So and it is quite in a marketplace of constituent that every political parties want to mobilize them in the electoral competition by using any means, right? Because there is no such a thing that can differentiate between like PDIP and now we can see P3. There is no significant difference between those two parties in terms of what they are struggling, in terms of how they perceive the political system, how they see the social, economic, and political life, how their strategy to make citizens more prosperous. There is no different ideology. There is no different strategy. But in the electoral competition, they're almost the same in using. They can use any means, any instrument to mobilize support. In the recent development, mobilizing Islamic narratives is quite effective to mobilize support, especially after Ahok case, 2017 Ahok case, right? Because it's as if people have imagination that Islam is becoming, there is like a bright future of Islamic movement after the 212 movement in 2016 and 2017. That's why they have high hopes in struggling Islamic political ideals through any political parties. But the fact is that many political parties, including those that embrace Islamic views, Islamic-based parties, and Islamic parties, Islam like PKS, is still very limited, and that's why they can use many other means to mobilize support. We can see in the Ahok case, also, in the 2017 Jakarta gubernatorial election, including Anies Baswedan, he was the advocate of religious pluralism, and he was supported by secular nationalist parties, right? Also Ahy, but they can mobilize Islamic conservatism narratives due to in the context of electoral competitions. So they can use any means to make, because political parties in Indonesia, there is no difference among them, and they have no strong social basis. So far, the main instrument that they use are like money politics, right? They use quite a lot of money in the electoral competitions. And they also sometimes use violence in several local elections, mobilizing preman. And they also mobilize identity politics, including like the narrative of Islamic radicalism, narrative of Islamic like moderate Islam's narrative. Those are part of the instrument used by political parties that have no social basis and that have no particular ideologies that differentiate between one party to another. Thank you. Over to you, Pak Riza.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the time for this parallel session nearly up. So I will end this session, and I will not to conclude all points raised by all speakers, but I think in general it can be said that as we heard from the presentation of Professor Nadir, between human rights and Islam should not be contrasted each other. Yeah. And from Miss Diana, we can learn how it looks like becoming minority Muslim in Australia, in particular regarding Muslim women in Australia. And from the presentation of Mr. Abdul, we learned that there is an increasingly Islamic conservatism in Indonesia. Unfortunately, the political system at the moment not provide a political vehicle for them. So it's a homework for Indonesian democracy, how to accommodate the supporter of the so-called political conservatism into democratic political system. And I would like to say thank you to all speakers, and also thank you for all participants, both in this room and on Zoom. And I think it's a fruitful discussion for this parallel session, talking about the role of civil society and media in relating to human rights and Islam. Of course, there's no a single conclusion on that big issue. We can conclude by ourselves. Once again, thank you very much, and I will end this session.